She read the clause a second time, not because she had misunderstood it the first, but because she wished to be entirely certain before she did anything as irreversible as understanding it. The document had come to the yellow sitting room by the sort of small clerical error that houses like Ashbourne House produce, and then forget by luncheon. A junior solicitor in London for the season, and eager to please, had left the marriage settlement on the escritoire under the window rather than on the steward's desk in the room beyond it. He had learned, as young men in solicitors' offices generally learn, that left in the yellow room and left for the yellow room were not interchangeable instructions in a house of this size, and that the distinction, once made, could not be unmade. The clause occupied 3 lines on page 7, wedged between the provisions for pin money and the entail of the Shropshire acres, and it stated, in the measured prose of a man who had been paid by the word and given no reason to economize, that should the Duchess of Ashbourne fail to produce a living male heir within 6 years of the wedding date, the administration of her personal charitable disbursements would require the written approval of the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne. 6 years. The wedding had been in April of 1809. It was the 17th of October, 1814. She did not need to count twice. October in Mayfair was the colour of pewter that morning, and the fire in the yellow sitting-room had been laid before dawn by a housemaid whose name Rosalind had made a point of learning, and whose small, careful arrangements of coal she still noticed after 5 years. There was a bowl of late chrysanthemums on the mantel, brought up from the Shropshire glasshouse in a wicker basket lined with straw. There was the faint, dry ticking of the clock on the writing table, which had been her father's, which she had brought with her to this house, and which she had wound herself every morning of the last 5 years, because there were certain small, unremarkable acts by which a woman established, without argument and without noise, that a room belonged to her. The yellow sitting-room had been quiet before she read the clause. It was quiet after. What had changed, precisely, was the quality of Rosalind's own stillness. It was not shock which makes noise. It was the quieter state that follows shock, when everything uncertain resolves into one legible line. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne. She was 27 years old. She had married Edmund Vane, the 8th Duke of Ashbourne, on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of April, 5 years and 6 months ago, in a small ceremony that the London papers had described as becomingly private, and that her mother-in-law had described more accurately as what one does with people who have not yet learned the language. She had learned the language. That was the point of the last 5 years. The clause was written in the language, and now she could read it. She set the document face down on the desktop with the care of a woman laying out an instrument for a task she had not yet decided to perform, and she rang for Hatchett. "The grey travelling dress," she said when Hatchett came in. "The wool, not the silk, and the small trunk with the blue cord. Shall I inform His Grace, your Grace?" "No," said Rosalind, without heat and without particular emphasis, in the way one declines a second helping of something one had not much cared for the first time. Hatchett curtsied and went, and Rosalind stood at the window looking down into Bruton Street, which was thin with rain, and thinner with the sort of traffic that a Tuesday in October produces in this part of Mayfair. A barouche moving south, a girl in a brown pelisse hurrying with a covered basket, the muffin man 3 doors away with his tray held level on his palm. She had come to the window, and she had not, she noticed, made any particular decision to come to it. Her hand rested on the sash. The rain was fine and steady, and had the specific autumnal smell of coal smoke that London wore between the equinox and Christmas, the smell she had learned to love, in the way one learns to love a house that one has not chosen. Somewhere in the corridor, earlier than the Duke usually left his study, Rosalind heard Edmund's voice, low, characteristically unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it, asking someone a question in a tone she could not make out. She was folding a shawl when his footsteps paused outside the door. His knock, when it came, was quiet. It was the knock of a man uncertain of his welcome who had come anyway, because the alternative was the corridor, and corridors, even in the finest houses, have a way of making a duke look considerably smaller than his title suggests. Rosalind did not answer. She was folding a shawl. She was very good at it. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. The city, the hour. I read every one. And if these stories of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe a little more slowly, leave a subscription here on the channel. It is my quiet way of knowing you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in the England of the Regency. Characters, names, and situations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or events is mere coincidence. The house at number 11 Bruton Street had belonged to the Dukes of Ashbourne for 4 generations, and to the Vane family since the reign of the second George, and it had, like the family, the sort of quiet consequence that did not require the drawing of attention to itself. Its facade was pale stone, its rooms were well proportioned. Its yellow sitting room, on the first floor above the street, had a bowed window with a view of the plane tree that grew in the pavement, and had been since the wedding the room in which Rosalind kept her correspondence, alphabetized by county in a japanned box, her housekeeping ledger in her own even hand, and, in the second drawer on the left, a small ivory paper knife that had belonged to her mother and that she used every morning without ceremony. If you were to ask any servant in the house whom the yellow sitting room belonged to, they would tell you it belonged to her Grace. And they would tell you this with the very slight smile of a person who has been asked an obvious question by a stranger. But if you were to ask the Dowager Duchess, who lived when in London, on the floor above, and who came down to the yellow sitting room only on Wednesdays, because Wednesday had been her afternoon of at-homes since she was herself a young bride, the Dowager would tell you the yellow sitting room belonged, as all the rooms of Ashbourne House belonged, to the House of Vane, and that duchesses were only ever the caretakers of what had been given them. Rosalind knew this because the Dowager had told her once 5 years ago, on a March morning of pale and hesitant sunlight, when Rosalind had been 6 weeks married, and the 2 women had sat across from one another over a tray of tea that Rosalind had ordered, and the Dowager had not touched. "A duchess does not cry, my dear," the Dowager had said, in the mild, helpful tone of a woman explaining what everyone already understood. "It is not that she has nothing to cry about. It is that a duchess who cries teaches the house to notice her tears, and a house that notices does not work." Rosalind had been 22. She had come from a country parsonage in Herefordshire, and from a father whose sermons ran to a length the parishioners endured with the patience of people who had known worse. She had married a duke because a duke had asked her, in a hedge maze at a country party, whether she preferred pears to apples, and had listened to the answer as though it mattered to him. That was the whole of the courtship as she remembered it. There had been other conversations, and there had been the arrangements with the settlement, and there had been the introduction to the Dowager over an interminable dinner in a house on Portman Square. But it was the pears that Rosalind remembered, the pears, and the way Edmund had said at the end, "Then we shall plant pears, if you like," with the expression of one who had already begun to draw the espalier in his head. She had not cried at 22 when the Dowager told her that duchesses do not cry. She had inclined her head and had said, "I understand," in the small, clear voice of a girl who understood a great deal more than she had been given credit for. And the Dowager, satisfied, had rung for the tray to be taken. Rosalind had put the sentence away in the specific mental drawer she kept for the useful instructions given to a bride, and she had not cried in the 5 years since. She had had, in that time, what any woman married into a great house has: the interviews with the housekeeper, the reorganization of the linen cupboards, the death of Edmund's youngest cousin from a fever on the peninsula, the failure of the north wall of the Shropshire orchard in a bad January, The 2 months in 1812, when the doctor had come 3 times a week, and Rosalind had known before he told her that there would be no child that year either. She had not cried at any of it. She had folded a great many shawls. She was very good at it. The knock at the door came again, quieter this time, not a repetition. The knock of a man who has understood that the first knock had been heard and had decided to knock a second time anyway. "Rosalind," Edmund said through the wood. She did not lift her head. "Rosalind," he said again, and his voice was the same voice she had heard on the corridor a moment before, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. But there was something in it now that had not been in it a moment before, and Rosalind, folding still, though she had folded the shawl already and was folding it now for the second time in the way one performs a small, pointless task in order to have somewhere to look, heard the something without wanting to name it. She turned to the window and did not answer. After a moment, his footsteps went away down the corridor. The charitable disbursements had begun in the second year of the marriage without discussion, because Rosalind had not seen any reason discussion should be required, and no one had suggested it. There were 3 of them, and Rosalind kept the ledger for them in a small green book on the left side of the escritoire, and she balanced the book on the last Tuesday of each month with the same instrument, the ivory paper knife, sharpened for the purpose, that she used to open her correspondence. The first was a school. The rector at Ashbourne St. Mary, in the village at the foot of the Shropshire Hill, had 3 unmarried daughters and a small living, and the eldest of the daughters had wished, in the mild, half-mumbled way of a girl who had not been encouraged to wish for anything, to teach the children of the village to read. Rosalind had gone to see her in the second summer of the marriage, and had come home 2 hours later without saying anything to anyone, and had written that same night to her father's old solicitor in Ludlow to arrange for the annual quarterage. £147.11, a figure the solicitor had produced by calculating the rent of the schoolroom, the salary of 1 teacher, the wax candles, the coal, and the 12 slates and the 12 primers, and by rounding, as solicitors will, to the nearest shilling. The school had opened at Michaelmas. It had, in the 2¼ years since, taught 43 children the alphabet, 29 of them the multiplication table, and 11 of them enough of the catechism to satisfy the rector. The second was an annuity. There had been a milliner in Bath, a modest establishment on Milsom Street, of the sort a bride's mother patronizes, because the more fashionable establishments will not measure a country girl without a dukedom in hand, and the milliner had made for Rosalind, in the spring of 1809, the 3 mourning caps that had come with her to Ashbourne House, and that she still wore, though they were unfashionable now. Because a woman who had been fitted with care in a season of upheaval remembers the fitting. The milliner had died the following winter of the sort of chest complaint that Bath winters produced with regularity, and had left a widow with 2 small boys and a shop that could not be carried on. Rosalind had arranged the annuity, £32 a year quarterly, in the widow's name, with the same solicitor in Ludlow, and had never spoken of it, and the widow had never known where the money came from, only that it came in a plain envelope on the 2nd Friday of each quarter, and that it was enough to keep the 2 boys in shoes and to pay the rent of a room above a chandler's shop on the London road. The third was a lending library. There was a small stone building on Wild Cop in Shrewsbury, which had been the counting house of a wool merchant who had failed in the war, and which had been rented since 1811 by a subscription society for the purpose of keeping a lending library open to the sort of person in Shrewsbury who could not afford Hookham's on Bond Street, and who would not, in any case, have been welcome at Hookham's. The subscription had never been quite adequate to the rent. Rosalind had made up the shortfall, quietly, through the same solicitor, for the last 3 years. She had chosen the books, sometimes, from the parcels her own bookseller sent up to Shropshire. She had, on one occasion, when a member of the society had proposed removing the novels on grounds of morality, written a letter of 2 paragraphs that the society had read at its next meeting and had, without further debate, decided against the proposal. None of these 3 arrangements had been mentioned to Edmund, not because she had wished to conceal them from him, because she had not at any point imagined that they were the kind of thing that required mentioning. She had married a man of very substantial means. She had a very handsome allowance for pin money and for charities. She had a solicitor of her own who did what she asked of him, and she had, she believed, arrived at the age of 27 with the sort of clear conscience that came of never having spent money in ways she could not defend. The clause on page 7 of the marriage settlement had not asked her whether she could defend it. The clause had said, in the measured prose of a man being paid by the word, that her defense was insufficient, that she required a written approval, and that the written approval, in the specific event of her failure to produce a living male heir within 6 years of the wedding date, was to come not from Edmund. The clause did not mention Edmund at all, but from the dowager. Rosalind had understood. In the 2 minutes it took her to read the clause a second time, several things she had not understood the first. She had understood that the clause was 5.5 years old, that it had been drafted by a lawyer working in a house on Portman Square in the March of 1809, in the 6 weeks before the wedding. In the same weeks the dowager had been calling her "my dear" over trays of tea. That it had been signed by Edmund, who had signed, presumably, without reading it in the detail, the wedding of a duke required, and that it had been signed by her own father, who had signed, certainly, without reading it in any detail at all, because her father was a country rector who read Latin fluently and lawyer's English with the difficulty of a man who had not been taught to distrust it. She had understood that the clause named her by the title she would take on the day of her marriage, and that it therefore could not, in any legal sense, have been discussed with her before the marriage. It had been drafted, in other words, for the woman she was to become, by the woman who was to become her mother-in-law, and had been placed in the settlement at a page she was not likely to read. She had understood most quietly of all that the 6 years had been chosen with care, that 5 years, or 7, would have been the choices of a woman who did not think in the exact number of seasons a countess required to give a duke his heir, that 6 years was the specific number of a woman who had been counting. She had understood, in short, that she had lived in the yellow sitting room for 5 years and 6 months without being told the terms of her own residence, and that the terms had come to her at last, on a wet Tuesday in October, by a clerical error that had already been corrected. There was the sound from the corridor of the housekeeper's voice, Mrs. Hendry, who had been the housekeeper at Ashbourne House for 11 years, and whom Rosalind trusted the way she trusted her own left hand, asking a maid to bring up hot water. There was the sound of the maid answering. There was the sound of the barouche moving off in Bruton Street. Rosalind put the small green book with the ledger of the 3 charities into the blue corded trunk, on top of the shawl she had folded, and she closed the lid. The Duke of Ashbourne, seen from outside, and Rosalind had seen him only from outside for 5 years and 6 months, because the arrangements of a great house rarely require a duke and a duchess to be alone together for more than the 28 minutes of a formal dinner and the 4 minutes of a morning parting, was the kind of man who did not appear to be doing anything at all until it turned out that he was. He was 34 years old. He had been the 8th Duke since the age of 23, since his father had died on a March morning of a stroke that had been mistaken for the effect of the port. He was tall enough to be considered tall in a room, and not so tall as to be considered remarkable in a corridor. His hair was the color of dark honey, cut plainly, without the fussed-over careless disorder of the young men who came home from Bath, with a valet who charged 3 times a proper valet's wage. His clothes were dark and well cut. He had a habit, when listening, of tilting his head half an inch to the right, in the manner of a man who wished to be certain he had heard correctly before he assumed that he had. And he had, at all times, the expression of a man who had already thought through the sentence you were speaking and was allowing you the courtesy of finishing it before he answered. He rode well. He shot indifferently. He read in the evenings the sort of long histories Rosalind's father had read, and one autumn he had sent to Shrewsbury for the Latin poets because he had lost his copies at Oxford and had not, in the intervening years, remembered to replace them. He spoke to his servants by their surnames and never raised his voice. He gave, on his own account, a great deal of money to the Church of Ashbourne St. Mary and a smaller sum to a fund for the widows of the officers who had died at his father's regiment. And he gave, without saying anything about it, a very substantial sum to the household economy of his mother, because his mother had, in the phrase the family solicitor had used, when Rosalind once had asked particular views on the sufficiency of a dowager's jointure. He had, in the 5 years of Rosalind's marriage, said to her 7 things that she had put away in the same drawer as the pears. He had said, on the first evening after the wedding breakfast, "I hope, Rosalind, you will not think it presuming if I ask you to arrange the house as suits you." He had said in the second summer, when they had ridden out together to look at the failed north wall of the orchard, "There is a mason at Ludlow whose father worked on this wall in the last century. If you would consent to write to him, he might be persuaded to come up." He had said, on the morning of the doctor's 3rd visit in 1812, when Rosalind had come down to breakfast and the room had been quiet and the toast had been cold, "If you would prefer to go to Bath in the spring, I would come with you." He had said, at a country dinner in the December of 1813, when Lady Serena Price had made a small, polished remark about the childless duchesses of the northern counties, "I do not think you have understood my wife, Lady Serena." He had said at various other moments less remarkable things, in the tone of a man conducting a household. He had not said in 5 years that he loved her. He had also not said that he did not. Rosalind had learned in the 2nd year of the marriage that this was, for Edmund, not a silence but a language, that he expressed the sort of thing other men expressed with declarations by the more difficult method of doing what needed to be done, quietly before he was asked. That he had, for example, without saying anything about it, arranged for a specific rose to be planted at the base of the south terrace at Ashbourne Court in the 2nd spring, because Rosalind had said, once, in his hearing, that the rose gardens at her father's rectory had smelled of vanilla after rain, and he had, with the expression of one who took a passing sentence about a rose as an instruction, sent to a nursery in Kent for a rose called Vanille de Bourbon, and had had it planted where she would see it from the terrace steps. She had learned this, and she had learned to receive it in the currency in which it was offered, that is, without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement in Edmund's economy would have embarrassed him, and she had learned in her turn to say the things she had to say to him in the same coin, by the same method, at the same interest, until they had arrived between them at a kind of quiet running account, kept honestly on both sides, that had, she had believed, until the 17th of October, the ordinary decencies of a marriage well conducted between 2 people who had grown, without saying so, fond of one another. The clause on page 7 of the marriage settlement had not been part of the running account. The clause had been a debt she had not incurred, entered against her in a hand that was not hers, in a ledger she had not been shown. She was not in reading it angry with Edmund. It occurred to her with the neatness of a small clock striking that she had not once, in the 10 minutes since she had first understood the clause, been angry with Edmund. She was angry with the dowager in a temperate, slow way that had already begun to compact itself into policy. She was angry, more sharply and less usefully, with her father, who had signed a paper he had not understood, and she was angry, most sharply of all, with the girl she had been at 22, who had inclined her head and had said, "I understand," without asking what precisely the terms of the understanding were. But she was not angry with Edmund. She was, if anything, sorry for him. She was sorry that his mother had believed him incapable of managing his own wife. Hatchet came in with the trunk half-packed and stood, with her hands folded and her chin slightly lifted, in the manner of a lady's maid who had been in service for 22 years and who had, in that time, learned that the duty of a lady's maid at a particular kind of hour was not to speak until she was invited to speak. "Hatchet," said Rosalind, "Your Grace." "I'm going to Shropshire this afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace." "By the mail coach as far as Oxford, and the private posting from Oxford. Send to the Mews for the horses to be ready at 3. "Yes, Your Grace." "His Grace is not to be informed of my going until after the coach has left." Hatchet's face did not move. She had known Rosalind for 6 years. She was capable of not moving her face for extended periods. "Yes, Your Grace." "You will pack for a fortnight. The grey, the dark green, the brown wool, the lavender for evening at the rectory, the plain bonnets, no jewellery." "Yes, Your Grace." "And Hatchet." "Your Grace." "If at any point in the packing you find yourself becoming distressed on my account, I would ask you to attend to the packing and not to me. It will be more useful." Hatchet looked at her briefly from the other side of the trunk, with the expression of a woman who had wished for a moment to say something and had thought better of it. And then she inclined her head and returned to the wardrobe and continued. Rosalind sat down at the escritoire and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Mrs. Barrow, who was the housekeeper at Ashbourne Court in Shropshire, informing her that her Grace would arrive the following evening and would require the yellow bedroom at the end of the west corridor, and no fires in the state rooms, and no ceremony at all. The second was to the rector at Ashbourne St. Mary, informing him that her Grace would be at Ashbourne Court and would call at the rectory on Thursday morning after prayers if it was convenient. The third was to a woman called Miss Waring, who was the eldest of the rector's 3 daughters, and who kept the school for the village children, and who had. Rosalind knew, because it was the sort of thing she made a point of knowing, been unwell in the autumn. It was a short letter. It said only that her Grace would be in Shropshire from Wednesday and would very much like, if Miss Waring were well enough, to spend an hour in the schoolroom. She sealed the 3 letters with the small stick of red wax she kept on the corner of the escritoire, and she addressed them in her own hand, and she rang for the footman, and she gave them to him with the request that they be sent by the noon post. She did not write to Edmund. She had considered writing to Edmund. She had considered the 2 sentences she would have written, and the 3 sentences she might have written, and the 11 sentences she had, in some other version of herself, in some other room, imagined writing at various points in the last 5 years, and she had understood, as she had considered them, that any letter she wrote to Edmund at this hour, in this house, on this Tuesday, would say more than she was, at this hour, prepared to say. She was very good at folding shawls. She was not yet quite good enough at unfolding a marriage. The knock came for the 3rd time at 2:30, as Hatchet was closing the 2nd strap on the trunk. Rosalind had been at the writing table, adding a line to the household ledger. She had, without particular intent, been unable to leave the yellow sitting room without balancing the last 2 pages of the book, and she looked up, and Hatchet looked up, and they both stayed where they were for a moment, in the way of 2 people who had reached, without discussion, the same understanding. "Your Grace," Edmund said through the door. His voice was very level. "I would be grateful if you would open the door." Rosalind put the pen down. She looked at the door. "I have been," Edmund said from the other side of the door, in the same level voice, "since 11 o'clock this morning, at a loss to know whether I have offended you or whether you have been informed of some particular difficulty on which I might be of use. I have concluded on the whole that if you have been informed of something, you would prefer to inform me at a time of your own choosing. That is your privilege. If it is the first, if I have offended you, I would ask leave to be told what I have done, so that I may at the very least refrain from continuing to do it. Rosalind found that she had, at some point in the last minute, stood up. She said, without moving toward the door, "You have not offended me, Edmund. Then may I come in?" "No." There was a small pause. "I understand," Edmund said. "Then may I ask, at least, whether you will be at dinner?" "I will not." There was a longer pause. "May I ask," Edmund said at a slightly lower pitch, "whether you will be at breakfast tomorrow?" "I will not be in London tomorrow," said Rosalind. There was, from the other side of the door, no answer for the space of what might have been 15 seconds. "I see," said Edmund at length, and after another pause, "May I be told where you are going?" "I'm going to Ashbourne." "To the court?" "To the court." "For how long?" "A fortnight. Perhaps longer. It will depend on Miss Waring." The silence this time was of a different kind, and Rosalind, who had learned over 5 years to read Edmund's silences by their weight, understood that the name Miss Waring had struck him as the name of a person he did not know he was supposed to know, and that he was, at that moment, on the other side of the door, running the name against his memory and finding it, and understanding that it was the name of the rector's daughter at Ashbourne Saint Mary, and understanding further that he was not required to understand any more than that. "May I write to you?" he said. "You may. May I come to Shropshire?" She considered the question with the care she would have given a letter she was about to sign. "Not this week," she said. "When?" "I will write to you when." There was another silence. It was a silence of the kind she had learned did not want to be interrupted. "Rosalind," Edmund said at last, and she heard again the something in his voice that she had heard at the first knock and had not wished to name. "If you tell me that this is not on my account, I will believe you." She did not answer at once. She thought for a moment that she might. She thought of standing at the door and speaking through the wood in a voice that would tell him, without telling him, that the woman he had married was on her way to Shropshire because a solicitor had left a paper in the wrong room, and that the paper had contained 3 lines she had not been shown, and that the 3 lines were, in effect, an accusation of a failure she had not been permitted to answer. She thought, and she did not speak. "You may believe," she said at last, "that it is not on your account, but it is on someone's. It is on someone's. On mine, in the end. In the end," she said, "on all of ours. Not just now, Edmund. I ask you to be patient with me just now." The silence, this time, was the longest of them, and Rosalind, who was still standing where she had stood up, with her hand on the corner of the escritoire and the pen in her other hand, became aware, in the middle of the silence, of the sound of her own breathing, which she had not until then been aware of. "I am," Edmund said. "I have been. I will continue to be." And then, in a lower voice, that had the expression of one who has decided, having failed to say the thing he came to say a different thing that was less than he came to say and more than he was accustomed to saying, "Travel safely." His footsteps went away down the corridor. Rosalind stood at the escritoire for a long moment. She looked at the door. She looked at the pen in her hand. She put the pen down. She did not cry. She was very good at not crying. The road from London to Shropshire ran, in the autumn of 1814, by the way of Oxford and Chipping Norton and Broadway and Worcester, and Rosalind covered it in a day and a half by the private posting from Oxford, with Hatchet in the seat opposite and the blue corded trunk on the roof, and she looked out of the window at a country that was the colour of wet iron and did not think particularly about anything. She did not think about the clause. She had put the clause in the ledger drawer of her mind, alphabetized by the year of the marriage, and she had closed the drawer, and she would open it again when she required to. She did not think about the dowager, who would be at this hour in the drawing room on the first floor above the yellow sitting room, having been informed by Mrs. Hendry that her Grace had gone into the country, and having said in reply, "How singular," and having rung for a footman to fetch her a shawl. She did not think about Edmund. Not thinking about Edmund was a discipline she had learned in the second year of the marriage, and she had, over 3 years' practice, refined it into a small, clean skill that she used in coaches and in rooms, and in the interval between the ringing of the dressing bell and the striking of the dinner hour. She did think, because she could not, in the end, not think about it, about Miss Waring, who had been unwell in the autumn. Miss Waring was 31. She had a small, clear face and a way of looking at the world through half-closed eyelids that Rosalind had originally taken for shortness of sight and had later understood was the specific squint of a woman who did not wish to see her own hopes too clearly for fear of embarrassing them. She had been ill in October with what the Shropshire doctor had, in a letter to the rector, described as an inflammation of the chest of a mild but persistent character, which meant, in the plain speech of country doctors, that no one was certain what it was, and that it had not gone away, and that everyone was being careful not to say so. The school at Ashbourne St. Mary could not, Rosalind knew, continue if Miss Waring did not. There was no one else to teach in it. The rector's second daughter had married a curate in Ledbury and had 2 children of her own. The third daughter had gone as governess to a family in Warwickshire. The 3 primer readers, the 12 slates, the 12 primers, the coal, the wax candles, the annual quarterage of £147 and 11 shillings, all of it rested at present on the pale, clear forehead of a woman who was 31 years old and had an inflammation of the chest. Rosalind was going to Shropshire, in short, on account of a clause, but she was going to the rectory on account of Miss Waring, and she had known, when she had written the letter at the escritoire, which of the 2 she would tell Edmund about when she wrote him. She would tell him about Miss Waring. She would not yet tell him about the clause. She had not yet decided what to do about the clause. She had, in the meantime, an inflammation of the chest to attend to, and the 2 things she had discovered in the coach did not, in her mind, quite hold apart from one another. The clause said that her charities required a written approval. The inflammation said that they required a hand at once. She thought, looking out of the window at the wet iron country, that she was, for the first time in 5.5 years, quite grateful to be a woman who had learned not to cry. There was, she considered, a great deal of work to be done, and no one to do it but her. Ashbourne Court sat in a fold of the Shropshire hills, in a valley of oak wood, and the sort of thin, fast river that was called a brook by the people of the county, because they had known real rivers and did not wish to disturb them by extending the name. The house had been built in the reign of the first James, of the pale stone of a quarry 3 miles to the north, and had been improved by Edmund's grandfather in the taste of the last century, and had been left largely alone by Edmund's father, who had preferred London. Rosalind loved it. She had loved it in the specific way she had come over 5 years, to love a house that had accepted her by the small courtesies of practical use, the door of the yellow bedroom that stuck in wet weather and had been eased for her, the seat in the window of the small library that had been recushioned in the second summer because she had said once that she read there in the afternoons, the mare in the stables who came, when she called her, from the other side of the paddock. It was a house that had learned her quietly and that she had learned in turn. She arrived at 6:30 on a Wednesday evening, in a rain that had followed her all the way from Worcester, and Mrs. Barrow was on the steps with a lantern and a shawl, and the particular composure of a housekeeper who had been given a difficult instruction 3 hours ago, and had spent the intervening 3 hours making the instruction look like the natural order of things. There was no fire in the staterooms. There was a fire in the yellow bedroom. There was a fire in the small library. There was hot soup in the small dining room off the library, and a fresh loaf, and a plate of the local cheese, and, on a tray in the library, a bowl of pears from the espalier on the south wall, because Mrs. Barrow, who had been the housekeeper at Ashbourne Court for 19 years, had known that pears would be wanted. "His Grace, madam," Mrs. Barrow said with the small, careful lift of her eyebrows. "Not with me, Mrs. Barrow. I have not lit the staterooms." "You are exactly right, Mrs. Barrow. Will he be joining your Grace?" "I do not know." Mrs. Barrow inclined her head with the expression of a woman who had received an answer she had partly expected, and she took the wet cloak from Rosalind's shoulders, and she led her, without further questions, into the small library, where the fire was very high. Rosalind ate the soup. She ate half the pear. She read, without particular attention, the 2 letters that had come in on the afternoon post and were waiting on the salver. A note from the rector saying that Miss Waring was well enough to receive her on Thursday morning at 10, and a bill from the mason at Ludlow for the last of the work on the north wall of the orchard, which had come in at £11 7 shillings and 3 and was, Rosalind noted, 3 shillings less than the estimate, and she went upstairs at 9 and slept the short, shallow sleep of a woman who had made a decision and had travelled 160 miles in order not to have to make it again. She woke at 6. The rain had gone. There was a cold, clear light on the ceiling of the yellow bedroom that was the light of a Shropshire morning after autumn rain, and Rosalind lay for a moment in it and thought, without particular emotion, that she was, perhaps for the first time in 5 years and 6 months, quite exactly where she was supposed to be. She dressed in the grey wool. She drank a cup of tea by the fire. She went out at 9 on the mare, alone, and rode down the lane to the village, which lay 1.5 miles from the house, in the fold of the hill, along a road that had been repaired at her direction in the 4th summer with stone from the quarry, and that ran now, in October, past hedges of blackthorn hung with the last of the sloes. The rectory was a low, pale stone house with a kitchen garden and a plum tree at the gate. Miss Waring came to the door herself. She was, Rosalind saw at once, thinner than she had been in the spring. Her hair had been dressed with care, and her cap was fresh, but her wrists at the ends of her sleeves were the wrists of a woman who had lost a stone that she had not needed to lose, and her colour was the colour of a woman who had been indoors for 6 weeks. "Your Grace, Miss Waring, may I sit down?" They sat in the parlour, which had a small, clean fire, and Miss Waring's mother brought in tea and left them, and Rosalind, who had rehearsed what she meant to say on the ride down the lane, spoke plainly in the way one speaks to a woman who has been given no reason to expect indirection. "I have come," she said, "to ask you 2 things. The first is whether you are well enough to teach in the schoolroom this term." "I am, Your Grace." Miss Waring said it without hesitation, in the voice of a woman who had made the decision in her own mind before Rosalind had asked the question. "I have been down to the schoolroom every morning this week, not for the whole day. The mornings only. In the afternoons, Mrs. Ridley from the village has come in to take the little ones through their letters. She has done it in the past for 1 shilling a week, and she does not mind doing it now, for the present without 1 shilling, though I would rather she had the shilling." "She shall have the shilling." "Thank you." "The second thing," Rosalind said, "is whether you would be willing to accept from the school fund, not from myself in the personal sense, but from the school fund, the salary of an assistant, for the term, a young woman, if we can find one, whom you would train and who would take over some part of the teaching and who would not, of course, replace you, but who would relieve you of the sort of small tasks that a woman recovering from an inflammation of the chest ought not to be doing." Miss Waring looked at her from the other side of the small, clean fire, with the expression of a woman who had been prepared to argue the first question and had not been prepared for the second, and she looked at her for a moment without saying anything, And then she said, in a voice that was not quite the voice she had used a moment before, "That is very kind of your Grace." "It is not kindness, Miss Waring. It is arithmetic. There is a school, and it must continue, and it will continue only if you continue, and you will continue only if you are not required to teach 39 children 12 hours a day in the November of a year in which you have had an inflammation of the chest. I am asking, in effect, if I may protect the school by protecting you. If that is kindness, it is the kindness of a landlord to a good tenant. It is not the kindness of a lady." Miss Waring smiled. A small, tight, sudden smile, the smile of a woman who had not expected the sentence and had, in receiving it, understood something she had not previously understood about the woman on the other side of the fire. "Then, Your Grace, on those terms, I would accept." They spoke for another 20 minutes of the practical arrangements. Miss Waring would send, the following day, to a young woman in a village near Bridgnorth who had been trained as a governess and was between situations. Rosalind would authorize the additional salary through her Ludlow solicitor. The schoolroom would open on the Monday. Mrs. Ridley would have her shilling in arrears from Michaelmas. Rosalind rode back up the lane at 11:30, alone in the cold, clear light of a Shropshire morning after autumn rain. And she thought, going up the lane, that the woman in London who had drafted a clause on page 7 of a marriage settlement had not understood when she drafted it, that there was, in a village in a fold of the Shropshire hills, a woman with an inflammation of the chest who required an assistant at 18 shillings a week, and that any Duchess who was fit to hold the title would arrange the assistant that afternoon, and that any Duchess who required, before doing so, the written approval of her mother-in-law was not a Duchess but a schoolgirl in a very expensive dress. She dismounted at the stables. She went into the house. She sat at the writing table in the small library, and she wrote to the solicitor in Ludlow, and she authorized the additional salary of an assistant to Miss Waring for the term, together with the arrears of a shilling a week to Mrs. Ridley of the village. She sealed the letter. She rang for the footman. She did not write to Edmund. She did not write to the Dowager. She did not write to London at all. London wrote to her. The first letter came on the Friday morning. It was from Edmund. It was short. It said, "My dear, the house is quieter without you. I have not asked after your Miss Waring because I would not wish you to think me impertinent, but I have thought of her, and I hope you will tell her, if it is convenient, that a man in London has thought of her without knowing her and wishes her well. There is a mason at Ludlow who was to come up to the orchard next week. I have written to him to postpone until you tell me it is convenient. I have not spoken to my mother of your absence, and I do not intend to. If you would be so good as to tell me whether you require anything from London, I would very much wish to send it. Yours, E." Rosalind read the letter twice. She sat with it in her hand for a long minute in the small library, with the cold, clear light coming in at the window and the fire burning low on the hearth, and she thought, with the small, precise clarity of a woman who had made herself think plainly on the subject of her husband for some considerable time, that Edmund had written the letter without knowing what she knew, and had, therefore, written it in what he understood to be the language of decent silence between two people who had had a small unspoken difficulty, and that the letter, read on that assumption, was the letter of a man doing what he could with the little he had been permitted to see. She wrote back that same afternoon 3 lines. "My dear Edmund, Miss Waring is better than she was. I have engaged her an assistant. The mason may come up when he pleases. I require nothing from London. Yours, R." She did not in the letter say more than what the 3 lines said. She did not say what the 3 lines carried under them, that she had noticed he had not spoken to his mother, and that she had marked it as a small, quiet loyalty, that she had noticed he had asked whether she required anything from London and had not offered to send himself because he had understood, without her having to say so, that his person was not, at this hour, a thing she required. She did not say any of that because she did not, at this hour, wish to say it. She did not say any of it because Edmund had written in his letter the same 7 words she had over 5 years learned to read in his silences. "I am here when you would have me." She wrote the 3 lines. She sealed the letter. She sent it by the noon post. The second letter came on the Saturday. It was from Lady Imogen Hale. Lady Imogen was Rosalind's cousin on her mother's side, and had been at school with her at a small establishment in the Cathedral Close at Hereford, and had, in the years since, married a widower with a small good property in Warwickshire, and had, at the age of 29, arrived at the settled, cheerful, practical wisdom of a woman who had known Rosalind since Rosalind was 6 years old, and had, for the last 4 of those years, been the woman in whom Rosalind confided such things as she confided in anyone at all. The letter said, "Rose, I have heard, from 3 sources of varying reliability, that you have gone into the country and that the town is minded to talk about it. I do not ask you to explain. I ask you to know, in the event that it is useful, that I am in Warwickshire until December, and that the room over the stables is aired and made up, in the specific expectation that you will not use it. If, however, you should require to use it, you will find the fire lit. I heard also on the 3rd source, which is the most reliable of the 3, that Lady Serena Price has taken to referring to your absence as an event of interest. I mention it because you would wish to know, and not because you would wish to do anything about it. Yours, as always, I." Rosalind read the letter 3 times. She put it in the small green book with the ledger of the 3 charities on the page where she had entered that morning the additional salary of Miss Waring's assistant. She thought with the same small, precise clarity that a duchess who had gone into the country was, according to the arithmetic of London, either ill or wronged or afflicted with a rival, and that the woman in London who was, at this hour, minded to describe her absence as an event of interest was a woman she had known would, sooner or later, present herself. Lady Serena Price was 30. She had been the friend of Edmund's youngest sister at school and had come out in the same season, and had, with the practical ambition of a woman whose family had a great deal of consequence and not quite enough money to run it, set her sights on Edmund in the year before the wedding. She had lost, gracefully, in the manner of a woman who had been taught to lose gracefully, and had married, at 24, a baronet of no particular character and a comfortable estate in the West Riding. And she had, in the 6 years since, mislaid the baronet somewhere in the north of England and had returned for the last 3 seasons to a rented house in Grosvenor Square with an income of £800 a year and the specific unfinished business of a woman who had lost and had not, in her own account, quite conceded the loss. Rosalind had met her many times. Rosalind had, over 5 years, learned to speak to her with the polite exactness of a woman who kept her housekeeping ledger in her own even hand, and Lady Serena had learned, over the same 5 years, to speak to Rosalind with the polite exactness of a woman who had put an event of 1808 into a drawer she had not, in the intervening years, opened. Between them there had been, in the phrase Rosalind had come to use for it in her mind, an arrangement of drawn curtains. The letter from Lady Imogen suggested that the curtains had been drawn back on the Tuesday morning, and that Lady Serena had gone to the window to look. Rosalind considered this for the 20 minutes it took her to walk twice around the yew hedge on the south terrace, in a cold, clear afternoon of thin sunlight, with her arms folded under her cloak. She considered it with the temperate policy she had learned to give to such things. She did not, at any point in the 20 minutes, allow the consideration to affect the arrangement of her face. She was not observed. It would have been the same face if she had been observed. She went in. She wrote to Lady Imogen 3 lines as she had written to Edmund. "Immy, thank you for the room. I do not at present require it. I'm at Ashbourne on my own account. Please tell no one you have heard from me. R." She sealed the letter. She sent it by the Sunday post. She did not at any point that afternoon write to Lady Serena Price. She did not at any point that afternoon write to the Dowager. She did not cry. She had by that point largely stopped noticing that she was not crying. The not crying had become the water in which she moved. The next fortnight was as ordered as any fortnight of her marriage had been. She rose at 6, she dressed. She read the letters on the salver in the small library and answered them. She rode down the lane at 9 to the schoolroom on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, in the cold, clear mornings of a Shropshire October that was leaning day by day into a Shropshire November. She sat on Monday in the back of the schoolroom for the last hour of the morning, with her cloak over her shoulders and her hands folded, and watched Miss Waring teach 41 children the difference between no and no. And she watched, on the following Monday, Miss Waring turn the alphabet class over to the new assistant, whose name was Miss Prendergast, and who was 23 and had a small, pale face and a very steady voice. And she watched, on the third Monday, Miss Waring sit at the deal table by the stove, with the older children reading around her, in the specific attitude of a woman whose weight has come off her chest. Rosalind rode home each of those mornings up the lane, past the hedges of blackthorn, in the cold, clear light, and she thought, riding, that she had spent 5 years and 6 months in London, learning to be a duchess, and had never, she saw now, been closer to being one than she was on the mare in the lane, on the way back from the schoolroom on a Monday morning in the November of 1814. She wrote to Edmund twice a week, 3 lines each time. She wrote to Lady Imogen once. She wrote to her father, who was in the parsonage in Herefordshire, and who wrote back in his large, slow hand that he was well, and that the winter roses were doing better than they had done in 3 years, and that he had, incidentally, been sorry to hear from a neighbour that she was out of London, though he had assumed there was a reason and had not asked for it. She wrote to the solicitor in Ludlow 4 times, on the small, clean matters of the estate, a repair to a cottage on the North Lane, an application for a lease from a tenant she had known for 4 years, the annual audit of the account for the milliner's widow in Bath, which had that quarter been paid without difficulty, and she wrote on the 2nd Friday to the Subscription Society of the Lending Library in Shrewsbury, informing them that Her Grace would, in the following week, visit the library on a Tuesday afternoon, and would be very glad to be shown the register of borrowings for the year. She did not write to the Dowager. She did not, in fact, think about the Dowager at all, except in the manner in which one thinks about a piece of furniture in a room one has left. The furniture was in the room was in London. Rosalind was in Shropshire on her own account, at a table with a good fire and a small green book with a ledger of 3 charities kept in her own even hand. The Dowager wrote on the 15th day. The Dowager's letter had come, Rosalind saw at once by the private post, in Edmund's franked envelope. This was itself a fact of interest. It meant first that the Dowager had, as she had a right to do, being a member of the household, used Edmund's frank, and it meant second that Edmund had, as he had a right to do, being the head of the household, permitted the frank to be used without opening the envelope, and it meant, third, that the Dowager had chosen to write to her daughter-in-law rather than to speak to her son, and had chosen to have the letter arrive by the same post that carried Edmund's own 3-line replies, so that Rosalind would understand, in receiving it, that a family matter had been divided along a particular line, and that the Dowager stood on one side of the line and Rosalind on the other. The letter was on the Dowager's paper, in the Dowager's hand, in the Dowager's particular mild, helpful tone. My dear Rosalind, I have been sorry this fortnight to hear from Mrs. Hendry that you have not been well, and to hear from Lady Serena Price this morning that the town has begun to remark upon your absence in the manner in which the town, when left to itself, will remark upon such things. I do not, of course, ask for particulars. I ask only that you consider in the arrangement of your affairs that a duchess is, before she is anything else, the mistress of the house of her husband, and that a house from which the mistress absents herself without a settled understanding of when she shall return is a house that the town will feel free to describe as it wishes. I do not know what has caused you to go into the country. I do not require to know. I ask only that you write to me at your convenience with the date on which we may expect you in Bruton Street, and that you consider, in setting the date, that we are approaching the Christmas festivities, at which the household would ordinarily expect its duchess to preside, and that a duchess who does not preside is a duchess whose title is being carried at some cost by other members of the family. I would add, my dear, and I say this in the affectionate spirit of a mother who has, at various points, been useful to you, a duchess does not cry over what is difficult. She arranges it. Yours affectionately, Louisa Vane. Rosalind read the letter twice. She sat, when she had read it the second time, with her hands folded on the writing table in the small library, and she looked out of the window at the yew hedge on the south terrace, where the thin, cold sunlight had gone, and where the first fingers of a Shropshire November afternoon were laying themselves one by one across the gravel. She sat in the way she had sat 5 years and a month ago in the yellow sitting-room in Bruton Street, on the morning after she had first understood the clause. She was very still. She was not, she noted, angry. She was, in fact, entirely calm. She had reached, over the course of the fortnight, she now saw, without having noticed that she had been reaching for it, a kind of resolution that had the quality of a decision made without deliberation, in the manner of the decisions one makes about one's own life when one has had, for some considerable time, to make them alone. She wrote back. She wrote to the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, on her own paper, at her own writing table, in her own even hand, and she wrote, for the first time in 5.5 years, without the pretense that she and the Dowager were two women who spoke the same language and had merely on a particular Tuesday misunderstood one another. Madam, I received your letter this afternoon. I am obliged to you for it. I write to answer it in the same spirit in which you have written to me. I'm not unwell. I have been in Shropshire since the 17th of October on the business of the school at Ashbourne St. Mary, of the annuity to the widow of the milliner in Bath, and of the lending library in Shrewsbury. These are 3 of my charitable disbursements. They are the disbursements which, under the terms of the marriage settlement of 1809, of which I was, until the 17th of October, unaware, require, in the specific event of my failure to produce a living male heir within 6 years of the wedding date, the written approval of the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne. I have, this afternoon, arranged the disbursement of a further sum of 18 shillings a week from the school fund for the term. I have arranged it without your written approval. I did not seek it. I do not, at present, intend to seek it. As to the date of my return to Bruton Street, I regret that I am not in a position to give you one. I shall return when I have concluded the business of the school, the annuity, and the library. That will be at such time as it will be, and not before. As to the Christmas festivities, I do not doubt that the household, in my absence, will preside upon itself with the very great success that a house of this size, in the hands of the members of the family who have carried the title in the past, will always be capable of. And I would beg you, in that event, to enjoy the season without troubling yourself about the mistress of the house of your son. As to the observation of Lady Serena Price, I would refer you to Lady Serena Price. As to your closing sentiment, madam, I would beg leave, with the greatest respect, to reply to it directly. I do not, indeed, cry. I have not cried, in fact, since a morning in March in the yellow sitting-room in the 3rd month of my marriage, on which occasion you were so good as to explain to me the reasons why. I remembered them at once. I have remembered them each day since. I have, on the strength of them, folded a very great many shawls. I have folded at the last count £147 and 11 shillings worth of shawls. It is my intention to continue. Yours, Rosalind Vane, Duchess of Ashbourne. She read the letter over. She sealed it. She put it into the envelope. She addressed the envelope not to the house at Bruton Street, but to the Dowager's townhouse on Portman Square, where the Dowager had been born, and to which she habitually retired in the mornings, and where she read her private correspondence without Edmund. She rang for the footman. She gave him the letter with the instruction that it was to go by the noon post. She did not, for the first time in the fortnight, feel obliged to add a note to Edmund. She sat for a long moment at the writing table. She looked at the yew hedge. She thought, with the small, precise clarity that had come to her over the fortnight, that she had just committed in writing to a course of action that no woman of her station could commit to in writing without becoming, in the same act, a woman who could not, until she had settled the matter, return to Bruton Street. She had, in short, sent the Dowager a resignation, not from the marriage as the Dowager had arranged it. She sat at the writing table until the light in the yew hedge had gone entirely, and Mrs. Barrow came in to lay another log on the fire. Edmund's letter came on the third afternoon after that. It arrived by the private post. It came in an envelope that was not franked. It had been written, Rosalind understood at once, without the household's knowledge, had been given to a servant with the instruction that it was to be delivered by hand from Shrewsbury, and had been paid for out of Edmund's own pocket. The paper was thick. There was no seal. There was no salutation. I have this morning read a copy of a letter of yours, dated the 7th of November, addressed to my mother, in which you inform her, as a matter of business, of a clause in the marriage settlement of April 1809, of which you write that you have been until the 17th of October unaware. I write to say first that I was aware of the clause. My mother informed me of it in the specific week before the wedding. I did not at that time understand it. I understood that it was a form. I understood that it would not, in the ordinary course of things, be applied. I understood in the sense in which a young man of 29 is capable of understanding these things, that it was one of the many small provisions with which lawyers had been instructed to protect the family. And I signed the settlement on that understanding. In the specific week before I married you, I write to say, second, that I have not at any point in the last 5 years and 7 months understood it in the sense you have been required this fortnight to understand it, that I have not at any point applied it to any decision you have taken, that I have not, in fact, in the last 5 years and 7 months been asked to apply it, because you have not at any point done anything that would require me to apply it, and that I have, for the last 5 years and 7 months, forgotten it in the manner in which one forgets a form. I write to say, third, that I did not. I now understand from your letter this morning, know that you did not know. It did not occur to me in 1809 that anyone would fail to inform you. It did not occur to me in 1810 or in 1812, or in the January of 1813, when I found you in the small library at Ashbourne Court, reading the register of the lending library at Shrewsbury, with the specific attention of a woman who was arranging her own succession, that I ought to have asked you what exactly you had been told at the time of our marriage, and that I have, therefore, spent 5 years and 7 months in a house in which a paper was on file with your name on it, of the terms of which you had not been informed. I write to say, fourth, that this is a fault of mine, not of my mother's, of mine. I write to say, fifth, that I have this morning ridden to my solicitor in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and have instructed him in writing to draft an instrument extinguishing the clause. I have signed the instrument. My solicitor has taken it this afternoon to my mother's solicitor with the request that the instrument be executed by return, and I have written to my mother in a separate letter informing her of what I have done and of the reasons. I write to say, 6th, that I do not ask you to come back to Bruton Street. I do not ask you to come back at all. I do not ask you anything. You have not asked me anything. It is not for me at this hour to ask. I write to say, 7th, that the mason at Ludlow has been up to the orchard and has finished the work on the wall in advance of the frost and has been paid, and that the accounts for the household economy, as at the 1st of November, have been placed on your writing table in the yellow sitting room in Bruton Street in the event that you should require them. I write to say, at the 8th and last, that I have loved you, in the specific manner of a man who does not know how to say so, since the 2nd month of the marriage, and possibly before it, and that I would not, having failed to say so in 5 years and 7 months, choose the present hour to say so, except that the present hour appears to be the hour in which nothing may be said at any other time. I do not ask you to say the same. I ask you to know that I have said it. Yours, in whatever manner you will have me, Edmund. Rosalind read the letter 3 times. She sat with it in her hand for a long time in the small library, with the fire burning low and the light going out of the yew hedge, and she thought, with the small, precise clarity that had come to her over the fortnight, and that was still, at that hour, hers, that Edmund had done in 5 days what she had understood over 5 years, to be beyond him, that he had done it without her having asked him to do it, that he had done it, and had also said the thing at the end, and had said the thing at the end without asking her to say it back, and that a man who did such a thing in such a manner at such an hour, in a hand that was steady from the first line to the last, was a man she had known, without having quite permitted herself to name it, for a very considerable time. She did not cry. She was still very good at not crying. She did not write back. She did not need to. The letter had said at the 6th that Edmund did not ask her to come back. It had said at the last that he had said what he had said without requiring an answer. She had therefore been given an answer she could keep in her hand without spending it. She kept it. She put the letter into the small green book with the ledger of the 3 charities. On the page, after the one where she had entered that morning, the salary of Miss Waring's assistant, and she closed the book, and she went out into the last thin light of the Shropshire afternoon, and she stood on the south terrace, and she looked at the yew hedge. She thought, standing there, about the pears, about the hedge maze at the country party, about a young man of 29 who had asked her in a hedge maze whether she preferred pears to apples, and who had said, at the end, "Then we shall plant pears, if you like." The pears at the south terrace were, she noticed, still on the espalier. Mrs. Barrow's cook had picked some of them for the bowl in the library, but the rest were still there. It had been a long, slow autumn, and the frost had not come. She thought that she would ride down the lane in the morning, and she would tell Miss Waring that she would be at Ashbourne another fortnight, and she would ride up to the North Lane in the afternoon, and look at the wall that the mason from Ludlow had rebuilt for £11 7 shillings and 3 pence, 3 shillings under the estimate. And she would sit that evening at the writing table in the small library, and she would write to the subscription society at the lending library in Shrewsbury, informing them that her Grace would visit on the following Tuesday afternoon, as originally arranged. She would not, for the time being, write to Edmund. She would allow the letter to sit in the small green book. She would allow herself to think about it, in the manner in which one thinks about a thing one has already understood, without hurry, without a decision to be reached at a particular hour, and without the particular urgency of a woman who had not yet in her life been permitted the luxury of taking her time. She had, at 27, been permitted the luxury. She stood on the south terrace until the light had gone entirely, and she went in. The Dowager's letter of reply arrived on the 6th day. It was short. It was formal. It was addressed to Her Grace the Duchess of Ashbourne at Ashbourne Court in Shropshire. Madam, the instrument of extinction has been executed. I have this morning put my signature to it. I acknowledge to you without reservation that the clause was drafted at my instruction, that I did not, at the time of the drafting, inform you of it, and that I have not in the years since been consistent in reminding my son of it, except at those moments at which the mention of it appeared to me to be to the family's advantage. I acknowledge to you that this was not right. I do not, at my age, apologize easily. I offer you in place of an apology the fact of the executed instrument and the acknowledgement of a woman who has understood, at last, that a daughter-in-law of 5 7/10 years is a woman of the family and not a form. As to what you were pleased to write of the observation of Lady Serena Price, I have communicated this afternoon to Lady Serena Price the particulars of the executed instrument.